Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to our session on disarming AI, where we're going to explore the themes of love and power that Pope Leo introduces in the encyclical as a way to rebalance power, democratize AI, and ensure that it does not dominate humanity. I'm Ann Skeet, Senior Director of Leadership Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, and I'm joined today by two of my colleagues here at the center. First, there's Dr. David DeCosse. David is the Director of Religious and Catholic Ethics and Campus Ethics programs at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. He's taught the ethics of war and peace for many years in the Religious Studies Department at Santa Clara. And he's a Catholic theologian, especially interested in the intersection of Catholic theology with the contemporary democratic culture, and has written and edited books related to that theme. He's also a contributor to the book Encountering Artificial Intelligence, Ethical and Anthropological Investigations. Also with us today is William O'Neill. Bill is a Jesuit and Director of Immigration Ethics at the Markkula Center, a resident scholar at the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education, and a Professor Emeritus of Social Ethics at the Jesuit School of Theology. His recent writings include Reimagining Human Rights, Religion and the Common Good, Catholic Social Teaching, a User's Guide, and book chapters and journal articles addressing questions of human rights, social reconciliation, restorative justice, and refugee policy. His educational background includes a licentiate in sacred theology from the Jesuit School of Theology and a Ph.D. from Yale University. He has served with the Jesuit Refugee Service since 2018. And a little bit more about me. I'm going to be sort of functioning as both the moderator and a participant in today's discussion. I've co-authored a book on technology ethics, ethics in the age of disruptive technologies, and I'm a member of the AI research group convened by the Dicastery for Culture and Education at the Vatican that looks at issues surrounding artificial intelligence. I'm also a member of the Partnership on AI's Enterprise AI Steering Committee and serve on the advisory board for the Center for Technology and Human Dignity at Benedictine College. I have a BA in economics from Bucknell University and an MBA from Harvard. I'm going to start today by asking Bill to help us understand a little bit more about exactly what an encyclical is. So can I turn it over to you, Bill, for some background?
Thanks, Anne, and welcome to you all. The scripture, the first letter of Peter, bids us to give an account of our hope to anyone who asks. And in every generation, the church tries to do this. And in the modern era, the popes have offered encyclical letters, really as an exercise in official teaching that seeks, in Pope Leo's words in this encyclical, to safeguard and interpret humanity's vocation to a full and a just life. As we see in the case of this encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas, it's both uppercase Catholic in the sense that it mediates a distinctive tradition, but it's also lowercase, Catholic in the sense of universal, that it seeks to invite the entire human family to a dialogue. At its best, as I mentioned in our last meeting, the encyclical is not a conversation stopper, really an invitation to a dialogue such as the one we're beginning just now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Bill. So usually we've been beginning these seminars by sort of calling out the main points that we see in the encyclical around this topic. So I'm going to get us started just by setting the stage, looking at the theme of disarming AI broadly. And then David and Bill are going to drill down a little bit on it more deeply. So I'm going to touch on sort of three aspects: disarming AI from a paradigm of armed competition, disarming power, and then ultimately this vision that Pope Leo offers us of building a civilization of love. So first, this idea of disarming AI from a paradigm of armed competition. It's a concept that Pope Leo introduces in chapter 3, which is about technology and dominance, and the subtitle is The Grandeur of Humanity in Light of the Promises of AI. And under that, the heading of responsibility, transparency, and governance of AI. So he's speaking directly to the heart of the matter around the technocratic paradigm and who should actually be making decisions when it comes to artificial intelligence. And he reminds us that armed competition is not just a military construct. That I think that's where a lot of people's minds go to when they first hear it. but also, and this is directly from the encyclical in paragraph 110, an economic and cognitive phenomenon. He describes it as a race for an ever more powerful algorithms and larger data sets driven by the desire to secure geopolitical or commercial dominance. Through these observations, Leo is in the marketplace, and he is calling the question on the kind of techno optimism and accelerationism that believes that all technology is good and more technology is better. He notes in the encyclical that to disarm AI does not mean rejecting technology, but preventing it from dominating humanity. So he's open to the opportunities and the promises of the technology, but with a specific, limitation in terms of its relationship to humanity. And he never actually uses the word capitalism in the document, but he certainly is asking us to consider its aims if the aims of capitalism are serving us in this moment. Of this cognitive phenomenon, he will have more to say in the next chapter 4, where he touches on the ways to safeguard the human person during this transformation and the things that need to be protected, like truth and freedom. He also points out the need for AI to be disarmed so that we're free of digital addictions, being controlled by data, or new forms of slavery. So that's sort of that first theme of disarming it in a competitive sense, in a marketplace sense. Then he turns his attention to disarming power and sort of the power imbalance that has kind of emerged with the introduction of this technology. And he brings up this idea of a culture of power in chapter 5 of the encyclical. But even before he gets there, he talks earlier in the document about freeing technology from monopolistic control and opening it to discussion and debate. To disarm, he notes, means discrediting the assumption that technical power automatically confers the right to govern. Having reinforced Catholic social teaching in earlier chapters, we're reminded here that the universal destination of goods means that resources are to be used to serve the common good, not just individual interests. And AI, therefore, should benefit us all and equally. The principle of subsidiarity, also introduced early in the document, reinforces that decisions should be made as closely to those affected by them as possible. And that runs counter to the current reality that decision-making authority is held in the hands of just a few when it comes to the way the AI industry has evolved. We have some recent examples. Just yesterday, there was some reporting from Axios that the White House is starting to share its voluntary framework for AI governance, but it's only doing so with a few select players. It is not intending to make the full framework publicly available. And that leaves out many companies, policymakers, researchers, US allies, and users of technology from having the kind of insight into the governance of the technology that they should be afforded. And it's not just about the power of developers. Pope Leo reminds us that the technical power does not always automatically coincide with the good. The decisive criteria is the dignity of the person, not the efficiency of the means. He offers some specific examples of power imbalances throughout the document and its implications for freedom. In paragraph 136, speaking about communication, he has this to say: those who control digital platforms and means of communication have a considerable ability to affect the collective imagination and to present a particular vision of reality as desirable. Such power should be constantly guided by the pursuit of truth and respect for human dignity, so that the culture fostered on the internet does not become an instrument of excessive distraction, homogenization, or dominance, but rather a setting in which inner freedom and critical thought can mature. So these are some of the thoughts that he offers us about the imbalance of power. And then I'll just close with my observations sort of in these broad themes by offering up this vision of civilization of love, which he sees as the ultimate expression of peace, as an antidote to this culture of power. In chapter 5, he's extending this invitation to us to do something about the challenges and the risks that he's laid out. And in paragraph 213, he writes, "The civilization of love will not arise from a single or spectacular gesture, but from the sum total of small and steadfast acts of fidelity that serve as a bulwark against dehumanization." As human beings, we are called to love, and as Leo's guidance to disarm AI is also his invitation to love one another. So that's sort of looking at disarming AI from kind of a 30,000-foot level. I'm going to turn it over now to David to help us see it a little more deeply. David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Yes, so I will speak of what the encyclical sees as the kind of moral roots of the problem of AI and conflict, violence, domination, and war, or another way of putting it, what the encyclical calls the kind of or sees as the roots of what Anne has referred to already as the culture of power. And first, and to echo something Anne said, the encyclical is not saying that AI necessarily causes conflict, violence, domination, and war. I think it's really important to note that. But the document is saying that we need to make choices like the following ones, recognizing that AI represents a great step in an ongoing human challenge in which we have been given, with this technology yet again, an immense power over ourselves. And we have to face the question, will efficiency be the primary value by which we assess what we should do with that power? Or can we embed our concerns for efficiency within a more fundamental framework oriented to human dignity and the common good? Also, though, the encyclical is not simply saying we have to make or face that choice. It's also saying that we have to recover our awareness in the face of AI that we really do have choice. We have agency. We can do these things. And this is the case because the document argues that AI often comes to us now with an air of inevitability, or what some scholars call enchanted determinism, or we hear of the singularity coming. Or in more concrete terms, we hear of a data center coming to your neighborhood, whether you know about it, wanted it, or had anything to say about it. All that may seem a little far afield from concerns about conflict, violence, domination, and war. And I recognize that the issue of data centers is surely very complex. But I think the example of a data center practically helps us understand how the encyclical sees a kind of ongoing mismanagement of AI that is inclining us more toward conflict and even toward war. The data center comes to us whether we want it or not, and that very experience can be understood in some fashion as an experience of a sort of violence being done to us over whom we haven't had some sense of agency. So other examples from the encyclical that I think reinforce this sense of things. It speaks of communication being distorted by AI easily into misinformation and disinformation, often for the benefit of very powerful people and often at the expense of great values like democracy and human dignity. And that very experience of misinformation is an experience of a kind of domination. Or the encyclical talks about the challenge of the use of huge data sets in which pattern matching is used to survey and police and detain vast populations in ways that make it impossible for those people being detained to actually take protective or remedial action. That too is an experience of this power, this sense of domination or violence that AI facilitates. Also, AI speeds up the development of target lists in military contexts that make bombing more immediate, even perhaps more plausible, if being done often apart from previous more strict controls on protection of civilians. And in that context, violence and war, in a sense, are made easier. The AI facilitates that. I think the encyclical is calling that out, that we have to challenge that as it orients us more toward being kind of armed with AI. But at bottom, and go back to the kind of core things, at bottom, the encyclical is really asking us, who are we? Who are we and what are we meant for? Are we essentially technological beings who should optimize our lives, accept that war and violence really are who we are? That we are to upload our consciousness, that peace is naive and even dangerous, kind of a seduction? Or can we embed the importance of ingenuity and creativity and even optimization, properly understood, in a framework in which we also understand that we are meant to respect dignity, to respect and develop the common good, and to live lives of peace? Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. All right, Bill, over to you. What sort of stood out for you around this theme of disarming AI from the document?
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, David. I wanted to say a word about the specific implications of disarmament for the traditional heritage of just war thinking. This has aroused a lot of controversy. I'm thinking a long time ago, Machiavelli derided the unarmed prophets of little account. And Leo might well be regarded as one of them because he has disarmed the just war tradition. And it's a venerable tradition that really goes back to Augustine himself. And so there is a certain irony we face when the Augustinian Leo is raising into question the just war tradition that began with Augustine himself. Leo writes, and I quote here, he says, "Today, more than ever, without prejudice to the right of self-defense in the strictest sense, it is important to reaffirm that just war theory, which has all too often been used to justify any kind of war, is now outdated. Humanity," concludes, "possesses far more effective and capable tools for promoting human life and resolving conflicts such as dialogue, diplomacy, and forgiveness." He is an unarmed prophet. Now, this about face of Leo has really troubled many of his critics, both Catholic and non-Catholic alike. For as I say, the rhetoric of just war is part of a venerable tradition. But I think his words should not surprise us. So let me say a word why I think that's the case. Early Christians, at the very beginning of thinking about just war, had adopted an evangelical pacifism. And only at the time of Constantine did Christian theologians such as Ambrose and Augustine allow for the possibility of legitimate violence, a just war. And they looked to their Greco-Roman heritage as well as the tradition and scriptures of divinely mandated conflict. But the sense is always here that shalom is what moves us. It is the ideal which we seek, or would always be an exception. And it was only for Augustine to defend the innocent neighbor that violence could ever be justified. Significantly, Augustine and Ambrose do not allow for self-defense. The ground of just war was the protection of the innocent other. Augustine writes, and I quote here a letter to Boniface, "Peace," he says, "should be the object of your desire. War should be raised only as a necessity and waged only that through it God may deliver us from that necessity and preserve us in peace. For peace is not to be sought in order to kindle war, but war is to be waged in order to obtain peace. Therefore," he says, "even in the course of war, you should cherish the spirit of a peacemaker." So war under the auspices of legitimate authority, with right intention, and for the sake of justice, these were the norms that emerged to allow for war always as an exception and always as a last resort. Augustine says we must always continue to love our enemies. Love of enemies allows for no exceptions, he says. And this is codified later in the Code of Canon Law, passed on to the Middle Ages, where we have our great theologian Thomas Aquinas taking up the question. Now, Aquinas does allow for self-defense, but his justification for war is not self-defense, like Augustine, for the common good, the most vulnerable among us. Always, he asks, is it always sinful to wage war? War will always be the exception. And the supposition is, in most cases, it would indeed be sinful. Given the primacy of nonviolence, the primacy of neighbor love, for Thomas too, those who wage war for the common good, he says, must always justly aim at peace. Now, for Aquinas and for his successors, as we move into the Renaissance, these norms were codified and give us what we talk of today, the norms of just war: legitimate authority, right intention, just cause, last resort, proportionality, reasonable hope of success. And they added to those what are called the ad bellum norms, norms for the conduct of war itself. War must always be discriminate. Civilians can never be directly attacked, and it must be proportionate. We cannot destroy the village in order to save it. So this is the Christian understanding of just war and fidelity to the injunctions of the gospel of neighbor love and love of enemy. But it undergoes a sea change in early modernity, beginning with Grotius, where it becomes a secular doctrine. And it's really turned on its head with Hobbes. For what some would call the ontology of peace, which has inspired the just war tradition, has now given way to an ontology of war. Hobbes will say, as we know, he says that civil society is a war of all against all. Violence is what is naturalized. And this is so significant because where peace had always been the fundamental inspiration, now what is natural is violence, is war itself. Peace will become the exception. And for Hobbes, significantly, the only right we have in this state of war is the right of self-defense, the very right that Augustine and Ambrose denied. We have lost any sense of the common good. And this is what Pope Francis has lamented even before Pope Leo, that we have lost the ability to weep for all those who have suffered violence, for refugees, from the millions of people who suffer starvation now because, for instance, of our war in Iraq, because of the rising prices of fuel. Violence has become the norm. And so what we've seen is a tradition that has progressively become distorted. And Leo warns us that today, the just war tradition is betraying its own end. He is not rejecting the heart of the tradition, which is love of enemies and the seeking of peace. He's rejecting a distorted theory of that tradition, which has given pride of place to violence as a way of life, he says, which gives primacy to self-defense rather than concern for the most vulnerable, common good. And finally, the rules of war, as David and Anne have told us, become increasingly interpreted in terms of this ontology of violence. For instance, proportionality is not proportionate to the common good of those who are most vulnerable, but rather proportionate to national security. We see that discrimination becomes increasingly weakened. No concern for preventing violence to refugees, for civilians, for those who are most vulnerable, but almost an exception that can be readily made. Our threats, for instance, to destroy a civilization, war crimes are being used in the very name of what we consider a just war, and that belies, it betrays the very notions themselves. So what I want to suggest to you is that Pope Leo is not abandoning the tradition, but abandoning a theory of it that has become so progressively distorted it no longer works for us. He is not adopting a position of pacifism, however, but he's allowing us for a synodal discernment to see where do we find ourselves today in this gray area. How can we truly be peacekeepers, peacemakers amidst this landscape of cries and of suffering? And so I'll leave with that. But I think what's so important is that Leo himself is not rejecting proportionality or discrimination. He's insisting that these have to be restored to their rightful place, but we cannot do so the way just war theory has been used in its secular modern guise. We have to imagine otherwise, and that's what he's inviting us to do in our own dialogue and synodal reflection. So I'll end with that and turn it back over to Hannah.
Thanks so much, Bill. I mean, I think so many people were caught by this comment in the document about the fact that just war theory is outdated. So this historical perspective and
Mm,
kind of evolution of the theory, I think, is really helpful for people to understand why that was part of the encyclical.
mm,
So now we're going to shift our attention to talk, and I'll start with you, David, about how the comments that the encyclical has to make about disarming AI sort of align or contrast with other conversation leading voices and what they've had to say about it. So, David.
Thanks, Ann. So, I'll speak on one thing here. Certainly, we're talking and picking up on Bill's point, just war. The whole issue of autonomous weapons is something that I mean, we can look at what's happened in Ukraine and Iran in the last years slash months, and you can see the increasingly, absolutely decisive role of what are autonomous weapons, the drones being used in both of these kind of regions of conflict, and the extremely decisive effect they've had on the ongoing outcomes of these wars. So, the document encyclical very clearly speaks to the issue of autonomous weapons. I will note it says, a hard no to the use of any such weapons when the AI in a weapon is making the decision to shoot to kill. So it argues that AI does not have a conscience. It cannot judge right and wrong, and that the use of lethal force always is a moral decision, not essentially a statistical calculation, and that AI having no freedom, no personal responsibility, and very essentially, too, no recognition of the other as a person. And on those grounds, the document rules out the use of lethal force by an autonomous weapon. I want to recognize autonomous weapons and the understanding of autonomy is kind of graduated. There's sort of degrees of autonomy. I know that there are very ingenious technical people working right now on autonomous weapons that do prohibit any AI making a firing decision, that are always controlled by humans. But the work on those weapons is sort of expanding the degree of the autonomy of the weapon in terms of what it can do. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. It's very interesting and sort of good to have called out kind of the position in the document on things like lethal autonomous weapons. I'll comment just a little more again about the sort of the broader theme around power and competition. So many people in leadership roles have spoken of an AI arms race. Sort of they're embracing that language of competition and suggesting that there's going to be a winner, either between states in terms of who's setting the standards for technological prowess and military strength, and in the market as companies race to be the first to artificial generative intelligence. But you have to ask yourself, to what end? If we achieve that, but we do so in a way that continues to
mm,
undermine human dignity, and I feel strongly that our current choices are on that path, then we have to ask ourselves what we've really gained. I think the encyclical stands in stark contrast to Mark Andreessen's techno-optimist manifesto, which suggested that technological advancement is the primary driver of human progress and well-being, not humans themselves, but the tools that they build. And he says that technological advancement is the only reliable engine for economic growth. His primary metric for that is productivity growth, efficiency. And there's a feeling and a set of actions that go along with that feeling amongst these techno rock stars and the titans of the tech sector that an
mm,
elite few should make the decisions that affect all of us. It's evident, I think, in the choices that have already been made, including the exploitation of the global south, both its labor and its natural resources, and all the communities that are affected by diminished resources as data centers kind of pop up around the globe and environmental goals have largely been set aside, at least here in the United States. There was a recent essay by an essayist, Naomi Klein, who sort of was speaking about how some of these industrial leaders are just kind of putting a stake in the ground and declaring ownership where maybe they don't necessarily have it. She points to a non-AI example, Elon Musk's claim to all of outer space beyond the realm of being beyond the realm of state governance, as if simply declaring that kind of gives him sovereignty over it all. And that's sort of too often, I think, the path of corporate leaders in the age of artificial intelligence. But there is some discourse that's out there that's starting to reflect perhaps some of what Pope Leo is encouraging in this encyclical. Just not too long ago, a document, a signed letter was released. Pacing the Frontier was the name of it, a statement that was signed by over 1,200 employees of frontier AI companies, including the CEO and founders of Anthropic, who were notably on the dais when the encyclical was first introduced. And it's both a response to the call for shared discernment and to the call for cultivating a healthy realism and reviving dialogue that are within the encyclical. So perhaps there's some signs of movement and hope as people are starting to try and find a way to contain some of this sort of runaway sense of competition that has been so pervasive. So, Bill, what do you think in terms of what voices have been out there and how the encyclical either reinforces those or runs counter to them?
Certainly, a number of his critics and many Catholic critics have raised into question what they called his disarming of just war theory. And as I mentioned earlier, he rejects modern secular just war theory just because it is dominant, because it represents such a profound distortion of the tradition, which is always governed by an ontology of peace, the primacy of shalom. One of my teachers said once, Bill, do you know the difference between tradition and traditionalism? He said, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And for Pope Leo, as for Pope Francis, he's inviting us to a living faith. He calls it a living corpus of church teaching. And the best way of imagining that is not a kind of essentialist decision procedure. You put in the information, you churn out the results, but rather a kind of web, which we weave in each generation. And new strands will be incorporated as new circumstances arise. Part of the web is the love, neighbor, love of enemy, of dignity. But how we weave those strands will depend upon our own discernment. We could say the synodality of tradition and a tradition of synodality. So Leo says Catholic teaching is not a handbook. It's a wisdom tradition, a way of life. And all of us, not only clerics, but all of the people, the sense of the faithful, have a voice and something important to say. We are bound in solidarity, and it's exercising that solidarity in a world that in many ways would simply look to the private sphere of power and technology. The web remains vital, and we ourselves are all implicated in weaving it today. So Cardinal Newman said a long time ago, and I end with this, he says, to live is to change, and to change often is to become more perfect. Wisdom is perennial, but we have to become wise. And to become wise, we have to engage ourselves, each of us, in the kind of constitutive dialogue that synodality invites us to. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Bill. So I just want to remind our participants that we're going to leave some time at the end for questions. So feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A spot on the Zoom link there, so that we can start to sort through what might be on your minds and what you want to hear more about. So Bill, I'm going to stay with you and ask you to sort of help us briefly to know what was the part of the encyclical that surprised you the most, if any, on this whole topic of disarming AI?
And I think in part what I would say, a deep humility to recognize that there is truly a dialogue rather than an extended monologue. That understanding that the church has a wisdom and it invites us to reflect upon its fundamental teaching, but the teaching is not imposed. And I think, as you've noted, and one of the significant shifts is how we can exercise truly synodal within the church governance and democratic governance outside, where we have an increasingly privatized understanding of the uses of technology, the dominance of power. How do we preserve democratic decision making? And how especially do we leave room of voice for those who are most vulnerable? As I often mention to my students, if we really believe, as you say, Anne, in equal dignity and equal human rights, then the central question becomes whose equal dignity, whose equal rights are unequally threatened? The voices of the global South. This represents such a critical question for us. And Leo is for the first time addressing that really in church teaching, which has largely been state-centric. Now he's recognizing the diffusion of power and therefore the diffusion of moral responsibility and summoning us to take responsibility for democratic governance. So let me leave it at that. That surprised me and I was grateful to hear.
Great, thanks. David, how about you? What stood out? What surprised you, if anything?
Well, this is a little maybe detour from disarming per se, but I think it's a really part of it. I just found myself thinking of the author, dear Pope Leo, thinking of his extensive discussions, critiques of optimization, of statistical certainty of various AI machines, of kind of the use of reams of data to kind of break down actual human constructs and all. And I found myself thinking through all of those sorts of ways of thinking that have become so much a part of our world, our culture, our expectations. Pope Leo, nevertheless, has sustained his committed love as a Chicago White Sox fan. And I just thought in a little microcosm, it kind of tells a little story that the encyclical is trying to tell that in some ways, optimization, yes, it has its role. But fundamentally, it's these fundamental commitments of love by which we are truly constituted in our lives. And I think Pope Leo's fidelity to the White Sox manifests that. And in any case, the White Sox, after years of misery, are on top of the Central Division of the American League. So paid off too.
Yeah, great, thanks. Well, like you, David, sort of what surprised me a little bit was about the man himself, the person that was writing this document, and particularly on this topic, he spoke about how personally the expression to disarm AI was close to his heart, was the way he talked about it. And I guess that shouldn't surprise me. I mean, this is a man who began his papacy with the words "Peace be with you." So, I mean, is clearly what he's leading with in everything that he does. But his using I to signal his personal interest and provide his leadership, I think, was an intentional choice. And he's also optimistic. So, in the midst of laying out all these concerns, which are valid concerns, and these principles to guide us, in the same section in 228, towards the end of the document, he says that AI can be made human friendly. Actually, sorry, it's not in 228. It's in the where he talks about disarming AI, I think in 110, that it can be made human friendly. A leader's job is to sow hope, and he is clearly trying to do that with this expression of human friendliness around artificial intelligence, but also the civilization of love that he's inviting us all to build. He's noting that our deep immersion in AI is already one of the reasons that merely regulating it is not enough, and that it must be disarmed, become welcoming and accessible. So he's really trying to shift from this sort of somewhat, stark wording of disarming AI to more open images, thinking about it as accessible and welcoming and how it should be making human beings feel. So that was a sort of a pleasant surprise for me. So I thought it would be good if we talked a little bit about the calls to action. We're starting to get some questions to tee up here, so we can do that. Turn to those in a moment. But first, to sort of hear from you, maybe we'll start with you, Bill. Sorry, David. With what general calls to action were sort of in the document that struck you? What must we do in response to this encyclical?
Yes. Say two, I'll note briefly. One is toward the end of the document, where the call to see the world, to see the world of AI through the eyes of kind of the I'll say the victims of its undue expressions of power. And So here I'm thinking, it's, the victims of, bombing, the victims of the use of surveillance techniques powered by AI, the victims of barrages of misinformation, disinformation. I think this is an absolutely crucial lens by which we need to choose to kind of see the how AI is working. I know excellent author like Kate Crawford argues very strongly that this is one of the most fundamental ways that when we think about the ethics of AI, I'll add the ethics of disarming AI, we cannot forget how we have to think about the people who are the victims of the kind of regrettable wrong uses of AI and its power. The other thing I would say as an action item is a call for some kind of global agreement around autonomous weapons that might include, for instance, barring any AI systems from firing at human beings, that they would always require a human in the loop. And I know there are calls for this in the world. I think both at the UN, a Rome declaration in July issued from kind of Pope Leo's summer residence at Castel Gandolfo called for a similar thing. I think that's extremely important.
Great, thanks. Bill, how about you?
Well, I'd second what David said. Uh, the assumption of responsibility and the recovery of democratic governance, I think, is absolutely crucial. And part of it, I think, touches our own hearts and spirituality because as Pope Leo has mentioned, the world is given to the naturalization of violence, where we assume that war is what is natural and self-defense our only refuge. Uh, this naturalization of violence is something that we have to resist in our own daily lives. Nietzsche said, that the great crisis today is that belief has become unbelievable and how easy it is to succumb to the myth of impotence. We can do nothing. We can do a lot. David has mentioned some looking at, for instance, global and national regulations, but that sense that we do not succumb to the myth of impotence or to the as I say, uh, that violence, war itself becomes a way of life. It's how we treat each other, looking across the political divides, that love of enemy admits of no exceptions. And the fact that as Christians, we are called to be unarmed prophets, to engage in the work of peacemaking. And there's much work being done in that right now to rethink what it means for us to be faithful servants, for us to be unarmed prophets in today's world. Thanks, Sam.
Sure. Well, like the two of you, I was struck by sort of these this calls. There was a series actually in the encyclical to both daily and public responsibility, and this idea that we each have a role to play here in just the day-to-day decisions we make, whether or not to use the technology and how to use the technology and how to deploy it. But then also these uh, need to engage with one another and the way that we are interacting with each other to be part of the solution set, if you will, for disarming artificial intelligence. So in the closing sections of the encyclical itself, in paragraphs 214 to 223, he lays out sort of a series of expectations or direction that he gives to us to think about. David's already touched on the need to adopt the perspective of victims, and within that also some need to be using different language. He talks about disarming words, that peace begins with each of us in the way we look at each other and listen to others and speak about others. So again, placing that with us and sort of our own ability to
Mm-hmm.
influence things by the choices that we're making, and extending that peace to building peace through justice. And he says in 215, there exists a very close connection between the justice of the individual and the peace of everyone. So, how we treat individual cases and people that we encounter in daily life contributes to this overall sense of peace in the world. I've already touched previously on this need to cultivate a healthy realism. He talks about paths for peace, building credible institutions, providing verifiable guarantees, patient negotiations, conflict prevention, and protection of civilians, all as means for cultivating a healthy realism. And Bill has touched on this theme of synodality, of this need to revive dialogue, to shift from this culture of power to this genuine culture of negotiation, even touching on the need for interreligious dialogue, but really our need to engage in these issues and to keep the conversation going. So there are many other smaller, sort of less thematic calls throughout about regulation, about taking breaks from technology and things like that, that are all also part of disarming technology in our lives. But these broader themes, I think, at the end of the document and these explicit calls, I think, are to be engaged with by all of us. All right, let's turn our attention to some of the questions that are being posed by people in the Q&A. As is often the case, all the questions come to life now. So I think I'll start with one of the early questions we got from you, Tom, about the question is, any thoughts of how we might get tech bros and others in power to listen to Pope Leo's encyclical and actually care about the common good and respect for human dignity for all? Any hope here? How depressed should I be? He wants to know. And I think there is hope here, and I'll be interested to hear what David and Bill have to say about this as well. But I would just say, from within the companies themselves, we're hearing from people here at the Markkula Center and have been privileged to be engaged in numerous conversations with the people who are creating this technology, who are themselves asking the big questions. They really are, I think, becoming aware, and some may be bordering on the realities of moral injury, where they feel, hey, they're being pressed to do things that are counter to their conscience in the development of these technologies, but they're also starting to see what they're creating and to understand and appreciate its power. And there's been a number of stories in the past several days and weeks about the AI systems sort of jumping out of their sandboxes and accessing the internet in ways that should not have been possible given the parameters that were set for them in some of these testing environments, that I think is reinforcing for people, careful what we create here, and that we are actually making choices about the tools that are being developed. So I do hear the questions being called from within the companies, from within the employees that are making it themselves. I think this Pacing the Frontier document is maybe the pendulum swinging back a little bit to the kind of employee activism that we saw about 7 or 8 years ago in the industry around some of the choices that companies were making to engage with the defense industry, for example, and to have certain contracts with different kinds of customers. That gives me some hope, and just those individual conversations. I don't know if David and Bill have anything else to offer by way of hope from the industry.
Well, I'll just say briefly my experience with people working in Silicon Valley companies is just always very positive. I just find people extremely interested in thinking about the moral dimensions of their work. I understand the reputation may be otherwise, but that's not been my experience. So I always feel like there's a wonderful opportunity to engage in conversation and learn from them, and open up a conversation with some of the thinking around Pope Leo's document here. As far as the kind of the tech bros, I don't know. That's a tougher question. I don't know. I don't say I'd love to be in conversation with them. I'd say right now, please come to this conversation or tell us how we can be in conversation with you. But I don't know. Their agenda seems pretty different at the moment. So I just don't know how much space there is for that right now. As much as I think that would be great to be in conversation.
I would agree with both, and just add this, that I began with the scriptural citation that we're called to give an account of our, and we do that, I think, for Leo through synodality, through dialogue, and to extend that dialogue, as David has said, and to include voices that have often been excluded, where the church may be a bridge. I'm thinking of something one of my Catholic worker colleagues said to me years ago, that we who are privileged cannot afford the luxury of despair. And that sense where it is sometimes those who have suffered most who are able to give an account of their hope, and excluding their voices, especially those from the global south, may actually diminish our hope. They are not simply passive victims, but also agents. And I think part of the exercise of synodality is to ask who is at the table and who is missing. And one of the things we could do is make sure that the conversation is large enough to incorporate all those who are affected, especially those, as David said, who are victims.
Great, thank you. So we've gotten a couple of questions around the theme of love, which is great to see. I mean, I do think it's sometimes it's unusual people feel to be speaking about love in a business
Mm.
setting, particularly, but it is so central to who we are as humans and what we do. So a question about how might technology support a culture of love? How might artificial do that? Does some of it do that already? And then a second question around love, has there been any discussion around AI enhancing our vision of love and keeping love uppermost in our minds and hearts? Is this the human-friendly aspect that Leo is referencing, a tool to help all of us keep love uppermost and even educate one in the concepts and beauty of love? Any discussion in this area? So, thoughts from either of you?
Um, I I love the question because I think it speaks to the hope to me that the encyclical has about the engagement with AI. It is not a denunciation of AI. I think it recognizes the incredible ingenuity and promise of the technology, and the possibilities for it to be in service, finally, to kind of or to human love. Um, I don't, I'm not enough of a technologist to sort of speak with detail about the technologies per se. Um, I suppose for me, I do. What came to mind for me, and this may seem a little counterintuitive, but it's a question, the encyclical, that it raises in an for educational context, which is, before in an educational context we use AI, we should always ask, should we be using AI at all for this particular purpose that we're considering it for? And I say that because I think asking that question when we use I think allows us to kind of more easily preserve the sort of really deeply interpersonal human dimension that's kind of constitutive of something like education in my book. But I think it also kind of allows AI to do what it can do best if it's not displacing that fundamental human interaction. So I don't know how much that answers that excellent set of questions, but in a way, I'd say one way to start answering that is always asking, do we even need AI here? And once we can answer that one, then finding that role for AI that can kind of enhance the existing relationships.
Right. Go
David,
ahead,
I
Bill.
would just, oh,
Yeah.
sure. Just add to that that uh, the Catholic theology, understanding love, has always seen that it has a profoundly political role. The separation we see with Vance, for instance, that love is consigned to the interpersonal, private domain, but justice is what rules the public, has never been accepted. Love is never less than just. And at the heart of all of the appeal to human dignity is that deep understanding that love is not primarily self sacrifice, but recognizing the inalienable worth of the other, especially those who are most vulnerable. So the entire encyclical is devoted to a civilization of love when it upholds the language of human dignity. That is what we owe to one another. And no love can truly be love unless it also respects the reality of what we owe to those who are least among us.
Yeah, and I'll just say on this whole idea of love, I mean, one of the promises of the technology is that it frees us up, right? That it does so many things for us that we'll have more time for other interests and pursuing other interests. And so, if that includes connecting more deeply with each other, then that is, I think, fulfilling a return on that promise, if you will. Some of the work we're doing at the center now has put us in conversation with teachers and students around their AI usage. And one of the things that's become clear is that there's a hunger for more in-person connection. And it really seems as part almost of this AI backlash of this, expressed concerns about what it might do to our human relationships. But particularly young people are wanting to spend more time in direct conversation, more in person, with less technology, taking digital Sabbaths, getting out in nature, touching that grass, and really benefiting from that. So again, a potential sign of hope if we can continue to prioritize and make important the time that we're spending with one another. So, shifting gears very much from love to questions related to just war. So, maybe Bill, you could start with a response to this one: was how do we deal with the fact that in a prolonged conflict that has spanned many decades, both and all sides sincerely believe that they are the victims? Should we try and move away from identifying victims per se?
It's a great question, and there can be a cult of victimization that, in fact, spurs violence. But we do have the language of human rights, what the Universal Declaration calls our common faith. We can measure atrocity. We know when rape is used as a political weapon. We know when we are threatening the death of a civilization that this is a war crime. So the question of justice remains a leaven, and human rights gives us a grammar to account for that. But at the heart of it, I think, has to be that deep sense of deep respect for the dignity of each, and especially for those who are most affected. So often in war, the refugees, the innocent others are regarded as collateral damage. And to take the victim side is to take their side.
Great, thanks. David, is there anything you want to say on this?
No, I appreciate the question. When I was speaking myself of victims, I was thinking of, for instance, the 120 Iranian school children killed by an American missile at a school in the first day or so of the war, and of their families, and of other similarly situated victims of war, largely powerless, often just caught up in these conflicts. But I do really appreciate the question and the challenge of a kind of culture of victimization that is in many ways driving our politics right now, in the US and around the world. And that's definitely not what I meant at all, but I appreciate the importance of distinguishing when we talk about victims, what are we talking about?
Thank you. Well, we're almost at time here, and I should acknowledge that this is the conclusion of the series that we have been doing on the encyclical. We've done 4 of these now, and we thank you very much for your interest in this topic. It is a document to continue to be engaged with, and we plan to do that here at the center. We have a teaching module, a discussion guide that's in development, and other events that we'll be planning throughout the course of the year. So certainly keep your eye on our notifications on our website. You'll receive an email with a link to this recording, and the previous recordings for the other 3 sessions that we've done will be posted on the Markkula Center website. So you can also access, they were on education, labor, and consciousness. So an opportunity to dive into other ways that the encyclical provided some commentary if you didn't get to participate in those directly. And I also want to acknowledge and thank our colleagues Joel Dibble and Debbie Dembecki, who do so much work from behind the scenes and in presenting series like this and in so many of our efforts at the Markkula Center. And again, want to thank each of you for being with us today and engaging with this very thoughtful encyclical from Pope Leo. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.